So let's consider for a moment, what's the problem for the Chief of Staff of the Army to solve? And I know it's not the offensive line, or is it? Let's think about his challenge from a threat perspective. His real challenge under Title X is to build a force that addresses a wide range of threats. Here's an array of threats, a mental model that you can use to think about threats. You can't really afford to organize against the most likely threat, because the least likely threat is that of nuclear war, but the consequences of failure of that are so great that we have to treat that as our first strategic priority. And so the chief ends up making force structure allocation decisions, his design of the force, as a function of the cost of failure to handle a threat along these dimensions. So on the bottom axis, you will see intensity of combat, let's say from low to high and extending up into nuke land. On the left-hand side, on the vertical axis, let's consider the nature of the threat, ranging from conventional to special operations forces, with a distinction between heavy and light forces in conventional. And the dotted line represents a notion of the boundary between special operations and conventional operations. We're seeing more and more units asked to cross over. Soft units being asked to conduct direct action, light forces asking to take on some of the missions and skill sets formerly handled exclusively by special operations forces, especially when you think of civil affairs and nation building. It turns out that there are certain efficiencies that you gain and effectivenesses that you gain by organizing specific types of units to manage different parts of this spectrum. And so, for example, here's an array of what you might call the force over the last 5 years, where we have specialization in a mission focus on different aspects of this threat continuum. Infantry brigade combat teams, well suited for operations when the threat is conventional and at the lower intensity of the spectrum. Heavy brigade combat teams that can actually operate in nuclear environments and well suited for high intensity combat when the threat is conventional. Striker, created to handle those in-between types of missions where you have to be deployable, but you need to have enough protection and firepower to handle a significant conventional threat. So Stryker was really designed to fill that middle gap, to balance deployability and combat power. In special operations land, at the low intensity side, you might have civil affairs units that are in the nation building process, other units in special ops that are designed for high intensity strike missions perhaps, psychological operations units that are shaping the battlefield across the spectrum of intensity. Units like SF groups and ranger regiments that are capable of performing both conventional and special operations type missions depending on the need. One of the things you'll notice though is that in the blue areas there's always some capability gap where to perform missions in those areas we have to ask a unit to stretch out of his normal range of missions and respond to that particular contingency. It's a fact that you cannot afford to buy enough force to completely cover the entire threat spectrum. We spend more money already than the next 24 nations combined, and we still have capability gaps that enemies can exploit. And the red dots, or the red stars, excuse me, show you areas where an enemy force is taking advantage of a capability gap and causing us problems. And that can go across the spectrum. One of the things that you can say, you can consider and challenge the students with, is the idea that that our very success inside the domains in white have driven the enemy into those gaps, because we've killed all the guys that are dumb enough to fight us where we're strong. And so the only guys that are left are the ones that are at least smart enough to avoid our strengths And by default, they end up operating inside our gaps. It always provokes a food fight to suggest that we have succeeded our way out of a job and that our very success has created our own obsolescence. When you read literature on contemporary operational environment, and you read the QDR, one of the things that we see emerging across the world are the rise of non-traditional, non-military threats. If you think about China, for example, I personally am more worried about the threat of 1 million state-sponsored hackers who are practicing to attack our financial, capital, and information management systems, more than I'm worried about the conventional military threat that they pose. If you think about the consequences of 9/11 and the shock to the financial systems, imagine that multiplied 1,000,000 times. And so we start seeing the consequences of failure in handling those non-traditional, non-military threats represent a significant risk to the nation's end state, if you will. Well, if it takes money to manage all those threats, it's fair to say what's in the nation's best interest? To spend more money. We're already spending half $1 trillion a year on Department of Defense. Is it better to continue to spend more money there to try to eliminate the gaps in conventional threats, or is it better to spend that money managing threats in the non-traditional, non-military threat? If you think that the non-traditional, non-military threats represent a greater risk than the threat of conventional war, it's then fair to say that instead of buying the most army that you can, you should buy the least in order to allow for flexibility in handling these emerging threats in a non-military, non-traditional way. Then it's fair to say, what is the minimum mission essential army that you need to buy in order to maintain dominance across the conventional threat, but not more than that, so that I have money available to handle these other emerging threats? How much insurance is enough becomes the question to ask, rather than what's the maximum amount of insurance that I can buy? What's the minimum amount that still meets the requirement? Committing to a 30-year solution provides the enemy a 30-year opportunity to pick his shot. And this gets after the idea that the response to the Cold War threat of the Soviet Union was to create a 30-year plan to outproduce them in terms of quality, quantity, and throw weight of our conventional heavy force. And we got into an economic warfare with them. And that type of a fight, a 30-year fight, can be reduced to rational analysis. And that's the kind of system that we have right now in PPB&E. With a 7-year budget, long-term, 30-year scientific outlooks driving our acquisition strategies, and a very detailed, rigorous approach to solving that kind of analytical problem. But if you think that the nature of future threats is non-traditional, non-military, and that the enemy's morphing and finding our gaps, it's fair to ask, how sensible is it to try to make a change management system designed for one type of threat fit this new and emerging threat profile? At what point is it better to change the change management system than trying to amend